The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency of choice for decades now. But Ken Rogoff says things are changing.
It could keep its monopoly, but lose a lot of the privilege from it. People could be just holding less reserves, holding less quote-unquote safe assets. So I do think they're competitors to the dollar at the margin, the euro, crypto, RMB, the pound, the Canadian dollar, and they're all eating away at some of the dollar's dominance.
You may know Ken Rogoff for his groundbreaking research on exchange rates and central bank independence, but you may also know him as a world chess champion of the 70s. Either way, his experiences as a teenager playing chess in the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc and later studying at Yale and MIT under some of the greats in economics gives Rogoff a pretty unique perspective on why economies work or don't. His latest book, Our Dollar, Your Problem, studies the rise of the US dollar as a reserve currency and things that might cause it to fall, like debt.
So there's been this idea everywhere, but particularly in the United States, that debt's just a free lunch, that interest rates are always going to be really low.
Well, those days are behind us, Rogoff says, and
at some point you have to adjust. And we have very little political will to adjust at the moment. It's very hard to persuade Congress, to persuade the American people to rein things in until you hit a cliff.
Ken Rogoff is now a professor of economics at Harvard University, but he also served as chief economist here at the IMF in the early 2000s. He was invited back recently to talk about his book, which was a great opportunity to sit him down in front of a microphone. Thank you so much and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
So maybe we should start with how we got here. How did we end up with this, the US dollar being so dominant as an international reserve currency?
Well, the short answer is World War I and World War II. World War I really crippled the British economy, and sterling was the dominant currency. It stayed a dominant currency despite all that they lost in the war. The U.S. lost a lot in the war, but the U.K. lost much more. The U.S. began to rise in that period. And then after World War II, the U.K. empire just crumbled. The U.K. was broke. It was very hard to think about being a reserve currency. And beyond that, at the end of World War II, by many measures, the U.S. was 45% of global GDP. Wow. It was nobody else. The United States lost many lives. We paid a dear price in World War II, but compared to Europe, the United States was almost unscathed. So we were the dominant economy, and there was an agreement made towards the end of World War II, somewhat contentious with the British, that put the dollar on a pedestal. And we had this system where everyone had to peg to the dollar and follow the dollar. The U.S. could do whatever it wanted, but with one big caveat. For official creditors, we had to trade dollars for gold if they asked. So that was certainly a constraint on our behavior. The book's title comes from 1971, when Richard Nixon shocked the world. He was our president, the United States president. He shocked the world by saying, you know what we said about trading your dollars for gold? Not anymore. We're not going to do it. But so the dollar had been placed on top. On the other hand, the 70s, the dollar lost a lot of ground because it had massive inflation. Europe went its own way. And so it's gone through a cycle.
And as you just mentioned there, the title of your latest book, Our Dollar, Your Problem, I assume, I know it's a quote from Nixon's Treasury Secretary, but I assume it implies the U.S. pursuing its own interests. Hasn't that always been the case? I mean, what's different this time around in terms of the U.S. using the strength of its dollar to bolster its position in the global economy?
Well, let's go to 1971 first.
Okay.
The title captures the arrogance of the U.S. We went off gold. And the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, who, by the way, were really the only ones who were on the dollar standard. Nobody else, everyone else, had very controlled and repressed economies for the most part. The ministers in Europe meeting in Rome, where our Treasury Secretary, John R. Connolly, went and said, what are we supposed to do with all these Treasury bills? You're inflating. And John R. Connolly said, well, it's our dollar, that's your problem. And that arrogance is something I've never liked. But also, we didn't realize that by getting rid of the gold standard, we didn't have a plan for how to control inflation. It was our problem. That was a disastrous decade for the United States. So, fast forwarding to today, when we do things like undermine Federal Reserve independence, when we have budget deficit problems and debt problems that threaten inflation stability, financial stability, it is a problem for everyone, but it's also a problem for the United States. So, that's really very much where the parallel is today. We're doing all these policies that throw turmoil into the system and might end up leading to a better situation than if nothing happened. I'm skeptical, but trying to keep an open mind. But I think a lot of the suffering for the instability will be us in the United States.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to step back a little bit and get more of a sense of your beginnings. And a lot of our listeners will know you not only as a world-renowned economist, but as a chess grandmaster, and a title that you won in your teens, 16, I think it was. And that is remarkable. But what I thought really interesting was how you decided to move to Yugoslavia on your own to play chess. And this is Yugoslavia in the early 70s, right? So it's under Tito.
Communist Yugoslavia.
It's a communist state.
Yeah, very communist.
So how did all that come about? And did it perhaps have any influence in you deciding to pursue a career in economics?
Well, back then, the two best countries in chess were Russia, Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. There were a number of other countries that were good. The United States had a few really good players, but it didn't have a lot of tournaments. There wasn't a lot of sponsorship, whereas Europe did. There were tournaments in Spain, England, but a lot of the best players were in Yugoslavia. So I went to live in Europe. I was playing in tournaments around Europe. I was very good already. I was making money doing it. It wasn't a question of, starving or anything.
And so
I didn't have any support. I was just making money playing chess. And I wanted to get better. And if you want to get better, you got to play the best. And so going to Russia wasn't possible at the time. You couldn't go live in Russia, but you could go hang out in Yugoslavia. So I went to live there. And I would say I learned a lot. It's not just passing through for a day, but really living there, seeing other people's lives, getting a feel for what socialism was. I wish some of today's young people could have an experience like that.
Because it was a communist state, but fairly...
It was slightly more liberal. They had a little bit more free market orientation, just slightly. It wasn't China. China today has a huge free market orientation, but it had a little bit. Tito experimented with that, and it was considered to be by far the most affluent. But, I was looking around, it was not very affluent. I was everywhere in Yugoslavia. So when I was being taught later at Yale, I decided to go, and I decided not to stay in chess. Becoming an economist started later. I was taking an economics course, and I was being told Russia is going to catch up to the United States. Our textbook taught us that. A lot of the famous professors taught us that. And I was thinking, well, wait a second. Yugoslavia is richer than Russia. And, I stayed in the student dormitories where they had no running water, basically. I went off in the countryside. I saw what it looked like in Belgrade. And I tell a story in the book where, I once I didn't know anything about wearing suits, and I had an electric blue suit. But you travel around, and where I looked ridiculous in New York.
And you described that suit in the book as being the discount rack electric blue polyester suit.
I paid nothing for it because didn't know that it was important. But when I was traveling around in Eastern Europe, they go, "Wow, that's so cool. Do all Americans have such great suits?" So it gave me some skepticism about that when I was taught that.
I love that story because you use that to sort of explain how the Soviet economy worked at the time, in terms of the sort of limited availability of products.
The command and control economy, the way it worked back then, it's sort of hard for people to imagine who live in today's world. The government told factories what to produce. But of course, in fashion, how do you know what people are going to want? Well, they don't care. So everyone gets a gray suit. That's what the fashion's going to be. And it was like that all over Eastern Europe. They just had all not very nice material, and they were drab gray suits. So when they saw me in an electric blue suit, that was just, wow, the coolest person. So,
and going back to that circumstance where you bought this suit, you were going into your Rhodes
Scholarship interview.
Yeah, okay. And like all that experience you had in these countries, how did all that work for you in the interview?
Well, I mean, I didn't get my Rhodes Scholarship, which maybe I could have or should have, but I was asked by one of the questioners, is Russia going to catch up? And I said, I didn't think so. And he just huffed at me, you don't know anything. You're presenting yourself as an economist. Did you read Samuelson? Do you have any idea what's going on? But it was a good life experience.
So we know what the outcome was there. The ruble never did really challenge the dollar.
Yeah, but I mean, things could have gone differently. Russia had its moments when it could have gone the direction of China. There were these Brezhnev-Kosygin reforms. Brezhnev later became president of Russia. But it could have gone differently. He had these liberalization ideas. It almost caught fire, but it didn't, which are very similar to things China did later. So, I mean, that's one of these turns where Russia, I don't think their system could have necessarily rivaled the United States, but it could have been a lot bigger, more stable than it turned out to be.
So, in more recent history, has there been any real sort of threat to dollar dominance?
Well, the yen was a big deal. I mean, there was a period where the Japanese economy seemed to be overtaking the U.S. I now teach at Harvard, and some of my distinguished, even older than I am, colleagues had books about how, we all have to imitate Japan. And Japan back then had half the population of the U.S., but let's not forget the United Kingdom had a quarter of the population of France, much less Germany. That's not a big deal. Their stock market was worth more than the U.S. Their land was worth more than the U.S. They seemed to be just crushing us in everything. And we came down hard on them. And I don't think they handled it very well. Had they handled things better, I think Japan, instead of falling to be really one of the middle upper income countries now and not upper income countries where it was second to the U.S. Now it's not really much better off than Italy, which we know is not better off than Mississippi. They handled it very badly and ended up having a disastrous financial crisis, not coming out of it. But things could have gone differently there. There are these episodes in history where, had things gone differently, the dollar might be on top, but not as much. And then, as far as China goes, they made this decision to basically peg to the dollar for a long time, worked. But there was a period, even starting when I was chief economist at the IMF, where we're saying, you shouldn't do this anymore. Why are you doing this? You're a big country. You should have your own monetary policy. You're a fast-growing country, so if you peg your exchange rate, it tends to cause appreciation. It tends to make non-traded goods, services, haircuts, golf memberships, house prices go up too fast. You're going to get inflation. You don't want to have it. Yeah. And I will say, I talk about it in the book. I think back then I didn't understand all the dimensions of the problem they were facing. Mm-hmm. But we were telling them, and, I continued to tell them that, and many people did, you should pull off of this. Had they not stuck to this fixed exchange rate, which I think after a while did not work for them, after a while distorted their development, slowed it down, had they not done that, the dollar would be much smaller today. Asia is half the dollar block. And if China hadn't been circling around the dollar, Asia might be, a quarter of the dollar block or a third of the dollar block.
Mm. Yeah, and I know you're a big proponent of independent central banks, as many are. Do you worry about that these days? And I know all eyes are on the U.S. right now, but I mean, more generally, do you think that central banks around the world are going to eventually become, or there's pressures for them to become less independent?
Those pressures have been going on for a long time. So first, I think when I actually visited the fund in 1982, I wrote the first draft of what I think was the first paper on why you should have an independent central bank and how to use it. Theoretical model. There certainly been commentators, who'd made that, but how it could be a way of dealing with inflation. And I think it's been. There are other people who contributed for sure, but I think it's been the most impactful policy innovation of the last 70 years. People can disagree, but it's been so successful that people forgot why they needed it. So you see these populist pressures from the left, from the right. I mean, in the left, you see this in Europe. They want the central bank to help with the environment, to help with inequality, governance, et cetera, et cetera. You saw this at the Federal Reserve, where there was all this pressure to do these things. You saw it all over the world. The pandemic was a wake-up call in a lot of places about that. Maybe we just, should have them focus on their knitting and not have all this mission creep. But there's still a lot of pressures, and then particularly in the United States, where it's somewhat unique, but central bank independence is under assault everywhere. I've been actually writing about that long before Trump came in. I gave a talk at the IMF a couple years ago, a major G30 lecture about that. And so it's worried me, but never more than now.
So let's talk about what might compromise dollar dominance in time. And in the book, you talk about tariffs for one thing, but then also inflation, complacency, and several other things that you think might contribute to that. But you say the big danger is within, and you have a lot to say about debt, describing it as runaway debt, and you reject, if not spurn, this notion that U.S. debt is safe debt. What kind of pressure can debt put on the dollar?
So there's been this idea everywhere, but particularly in the United States, that debt's just a free lunch, that interest rates are always going to be really low. Why are you caring? Why are you worrying about it? And when people say to me, people have been talking about debt for 30 years, it's just never going to be a problem. The day has arrived where interest rates have risen, and if you believe, as I do, we're talking about long-term interest rates, that interest rates are going to stay high for a very long time. There's structural factors making them high, not just in the U.S., in the U.K. and France and Japan, everywhere. Okay, debt's a bigger problem. If you have everybody knows if they have a mortgage and they're paying 2%, they don't want to, but if you have a 7% mortgage, it's brutal. It's just something completely different. And we haven't jumped that much, but our interest payments to GDP have nearly tripled in a short period. They're bigger than defense expending now in the United States. Yeah. So this has really been a big change. And at some point, you have to adjust. And we have very little political will to adjust at the moment. I don't blame any particular leader for this. I think had the U.S. had a completely different president, we'd still have a giant deficit. Yeah. It's very hard to persuade Congress, to persuade the American people to rein things in until you hit a cliff. And that's why I argue in the book that it's more likely than not that that's going to happen over the next 4 or 5 years. I finished the book before I knew who'd be president. This is not a comment on Trump. I thought the same thing would happen if his opponent Harris had won.
And so we can't talk about debt without talking about the fiscal position in the U.S. And you, in the book, you also describe that as being concerning, to say the very least.
Well, sure. I mean, if the interest rate's zero, and that was the position of this anti-austerity narrative that a lot of left-wing economists, but some smart left-leaning economists also had, the idea we used to have to worry about debt, maybe. Now we don't. Interest rates are zero. And that this bled over into the IMF's work, to say the least. And I would say to them, okay, this week the interest rate's low, but you basically have a mortgage where the interest rate rolls over all the time. If interest rates don't stay low, you're suddenly going to owe a lot. And I was told, I gave talks all over the world at the U.S. Treasury, academics, certainly at the IMF. I was told, no, they're not going up. It's very, very, very unlikely. The dominant theme was Larry Summers' secular stagnation. Paul Krugman argued interest rates would be approximately zero, real interest rates forever. Olivier Blanchard, who was a great economist and I would say pretty balanced on the whole, but he also came up with an argument along these lines. And I've always said, you might be right, but why are you betting the farm on this? What if you're wrong? What if there's a war? What if you need a sudden military buildup? And we're not just talking about the United States, we're talking about Europe, although we're also talking about the United States. Don't you need an IMF speak fiscal space to do that? I think the public got sort of drawn into this. It became, in TikTok and everything, where they confuse borrowing, which is good. I'd love to be able to borrow and pay for stuff and make stuff free, and owing a lot, which is debt, which is bad. But the progressives and these other economists argue, nah, it's just not an issue because we never really end up having to pay anything, so why do you care? Well, here we are, today, where it's not just the United States, it's also many other countries, where maybe it'll pass, maybe interest rates will collapse again, but if it doesn't happen pretty darn soon, and I don't think it will, and I'm talking about long-term interest rates, not policy interest rates, we're all running into trouble. So getting back to the dollar and what competes with the dollar, it could keep its monopoly, but lose a lot of the privilege from it. People could be just holding less reserves, holding less quote-unquote safe assets. I could have a monopoly on ice cream in Boston, and if my ice cream's not very good, people are going to eat less of it, and you have to make money in other ways. So I do think they're competitors to the dollar at the margin, the euro, crypto, RMB, the pound, the Canadian dollar, and they're all eating away at some of the dollar's dominance. But the biggest problem is that maybe I just don't feel safe in anything, and then I'm not going to pay the premium. I'm going to demand a higher interest rate, and that gets back to the debt problem. We already said interest rates were high. Maybe they'll be even higher.
So one aspect of the debt problem I found surprising actually was to what extent this increase in U.S. military spending is contributing to the debt and to the fiscal burden. And, in terms of dollar dominance, does military power generally help to strengthen a reserve currency?
I think being a geopolitical power is essential to being a major reserve currency. And the fact the euro has done as well as it has without doing that is actually a testament to how many other things Europe gets right that they're able to do this. So having a strong military, first of all, there's certain superficial ways, but, that the money's safer because you can protect it. Also, there are countries which are in the security umbrella of the United States where it's sort of natural for many reasons to use the dollar. More subtle is that the military power of the United States leads into other negotiations about how the whole global financial system is organized. They can range from how the IMF voting works to how SWIFT, that's the international payments mechanism, works. And the sum of all this is that the United States dominates the back office of the global financial system. What do I mean by that? That's where the books clear. Ken makes a credit card purchase at some store. The store brings it to the bank, et cetera. Who's at the end of the day, keeping that accounting? We have this system. The typical listener has no idea it's going on, but it's a back office. The U.S. dominates that because of our dollar dominance. And that gives us power to do sanctions. That's why our sanctions are so powerful. And we spy on everybody. Of course, we use the information on what you're doing. You've got to be kidding. I think the Europeans who specialize in this are aware of it. So that's been a big benefit. And as we start to lose our dominance, that falls very quickly. So in other words, if I could only use American Express as my charge card, they're going to know everything about me. But if I start to have alternatives, they may not be as big in the market, but when I want to do something I don't want American Express to know, I'll use MasterCard or Visa. And I think that's what we're going to see going forward.
So finally, you describe in the book, there are moments in history where, dollar dominance, it seemed inevitable that it would fail or fall, and yet it prevailed. As a chess grandmaster who's learned to read the board and to sort of envision moves and try and figure out outcomes, can you see a scenario anytime soon where the dollar might lose some of its strength?
I think it's likely that the dollar will lose some of its strength, and certainly the U.S. is trying tactics to fight back. But let's remember, the dollar lost Europe. Europe used to be the whole deal. There's the U.S., Europe was the rest of the dollar bloc, and Canada and Japan.
Yeah.
There was nobody else in the dollar bloc, and Europe is gone. They're on the euro. Asia is now half the dollar bloc, and China is central to that. We're not going to keep China indefinitely. That's ridiculous. They're going to become a much more influential regional currency, maybe some trade with Africa. And anything people say about, they don't have rule of law, this and that, they have too many capital controls, that's nonsense. I mean, you can go back to many other examples where countries have been significant reserve currencies in that way. The United States had all kinds of controls in the 50s, the 60s, way into the 70s. We were still the dominant currency. They can take a big share of the market. They have a big incentive to do it. We're not going to be using the RMB in New York much anyway. Mm-hmm. But just the way under Nixon, that's where the title comes from, Our Dollar, Your Problem, just the same way that Europe was gone, I think China's going to be gone at some point. And that's a huge hole that brings a lot of other countries partly with it. So I think that's actually very likely. It's not the end of the world by any means, but I'd be very surprised if we don't go in that direction, because China has such strong incentives to have information independence, even aside from currency independence.
Ken Rogoff, author of Our Dollar, Your Problem. Thanks so much for sharing some of your insights today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Again, that was Ken Rogoff, Chair of International Economics at Harvard University, talking about his latest book, Our Dollar, Your Problem. Look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.